I think you can parse out or separate the history of African Americans and the history of America.
So often we segment Black history from American history. We look at it for a month. But as W.E.B. Du Bois knew, as Ida B. Wells knew, Black history is American history. The idea of the country being founded on a principle of freedom that excluded Black people.
And so what happened to those persons once they landed here in what is now the continental United States is very much American history. It's hard to talk about the U.S. Constitution separate of how that Constitution framed and discusses or even countenances African Americans. And so African American history is very much a part of American history. There are distinctive features about African American history that I think should be noted, but it's very much American history. It is an American story. We know that in the original Constitution, that the framers of that Constitution thought about slavery when they wrote that document.
There were founding fathers who were decidedly against the institution of slavery, right? Because there's this dichotomy. You have a nation that's, pushing for democracy, a democratic republic, right? And at the same time, there were people who recognized that irony, that at the same time, we're also trying to enslave a group of people. And so I think that struggle and that tension between freedom and unfreedom was really at the heart of some of the missing language or the language that they did not include. And there was contention there.
Well, the ratification of the Constitution was an important moment in a long history of trying to minimize the political impact of slavery or the question of enslaved people at the national level. So much of the ability of politicians at this time period to create a union depended on rendering silent or less visible the question of enslaved people. In many ways, the Constitution can be seen as in a long history of how do we not talk about slavery in a way that would fundamentally alter how we think about voting or democracy or citizenship.
When the Constitutional Convention is meeting in Philadelphia, they have a number of issues that take them a long time to figure out. The biggest one is just simply the structure of the government, right? What does Congress look like? But once they've got that figured out, right? Once they figure out, okay, we're going to have a House of Representatives that is determined by the number of people in each state, and we've got a Senate where everybody gets 2 senators. Well, now you've got to figure out, okay, when you say the number of people in each state, what do you mean by that? Because, a place like South Carolina, where it's a very wealthy state, but white people are in a minority there. Their numbers are actually not that large compared to a place like, say, Pennsylvania, which has, they might have roughly the same number of people, but if you're only counting white people for the sake of representation, you're going to leave slave states at a bit of a disadvantage, and in some cases, a very sizable disadvantage. So states that are heavily dependent on slavery, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, they make it clear at the Constitutional Convention that if they're going to get on board with the Constitution, enslaved people have to count for them in some way toward representation. And essentially what the convention does is they compromise on that, and they decide that for the sake of representation in Congress, enslaved people, each enslaved person will count as 3/5 of a white person. Now, that doesn't mean enslaved people were considered 3/5 of a white person. It has nothing to do with voting rights for enslaved people. It has nothing to do with freedom for enslaved people. It's simply numerical. But the consequences of it are that white people in slave states, their votes count for more than white people in free states. A place like if you took sort of South Carolina and Georgia, right? If I remember right, their white population put together is half as much as a place like Pennsylvania, but they have roughly the same numbers of electoral votes, right? So every white person's vote counts double in a place like that. And so what that does is it not only incentivizes slavery in some ways, right, simply as a matter of political power, but it also provides disproportionate power for slave states at the national level. They get more, each white person is entitled to greater representation than they might otherwise get if they were in a free state. The electoral votes that a state has is going to be more as a consequence of slavery than it would be if enslaved people were not counted. And so there's a sort of structural imbalance that's built in as a consequence of the 3/5 clause.
And you had folks who, the founding fathers who wanted to make sure that, especially in the South, make sure that they got that representation because they didn't feel that they had as much representation, and especially the slave owners, as much representation as some of the others. But that, I think, and with the eye towards the growth of slavery, because there were folks who wanted that to happen, wanted slavery to continue to grow, and because they were looking for the opportunities to make money. They understood where they were going, right? And this was really a way of making sure that they, could generate enough wealth and benefit from that wealth while not necessarily placing that in this document. So the references that were not there, I believe, we're just not comfortable with it, that there were folks who were really pushing to abolish slavery. And I think that contention is really what keeps a more overt mention of slavery out of the Constitution, as opposed to actually making it, a part and parcel of the founding document.
By the time you get to the aftermath of the American Revolution, most states had already either significantly limited or abolished the transatlantic trade. And so you really only have a few states left where it's still legal. But in order to get the states where it was still legal to agree to sign off on the Constitution, there's a provision in the Constitution that said, okay, we'll have no federal limitations on the transatlantic slave trade for 20 years.
Many of the founding fathers owned slaves, and for them there was very little of a disconnect or of a discontinuity between owning a human being and voting for what they would call to be the height of democracy in the world at that time. They were able to privilege a very neat compartmentalization between their power, their racial and gender identity as a white man versus that of an enslaved person. So much of the beginning of the Republic at this moment literally depended on the ability of founding fathers to segment their identity, their power, their status from that of a people that they bought themselves. There are many ironies that the founding fathers lived with. One of them is this quest for independence from a colonial power that they quite openly claimed enslaved Americans. At the very same time, the founding fathers are practicing human bondage, are deeply involved in slave trading, slave owning, in a way that brought them very little blemish. They thought this was completely consistent, which again turns on this notion of our founding fathers' ability to draw very neat lines that they could live with between themselves and their cries for freedom and the enslaved people who also cried for freedom, but it fell on deaf ears.